Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us for a full circle journey through what it's like to return to your ancestral villages in China. Today, we are going to go over everything from what are the fears and anxieties you might feel going into a trip, why it's important to have a strong support team as you go into planning a trip. What are some things you might expect to see or find or feel in your village? And finally, how that might impact your relationships with yourself, your family beyond the trip. And today we have joining us Huihan Li. He is the founder of My China Roots. We have Jeremy Chin as well. He is a moderator and genealogy guru here on the Discord community. And myself, Chrislyn Choo. I lead our community experiences here. Let's kick it off with our first question, which is, why were you motivated and what questions compelled you to take this step? Let's start with Huihan and then go around.
Thanks, Chrislyn, and hi, everyone. It's really great to be here with all of you. So maybe a couple of words of introduction. For those of you who don't know, I was born and raised in Holland, in the Netherlands, and my parents were from Indonesia. And what I grew up with just knowing that very long time ago, very, very, very long time ago, my ancestors came from China. And I was always interested in stories, and Indonesia always gave enough stories because my grandfather and my father and my mother were able to tell me about their upbringing in Indonesia. And we always used to go back, me and my sisters, every other year or so to Indonesia. So my China experience actually started around my 20s. During my teens, I got more and more interested and curious about China. And the first roots trip was went to the village of my mother's maternal grandmother. And it more or less fell into my lap. And especially looking back, it was that roots trip that made me really get into roots and that made me want to find out about all the other branches, and at some point also start my China roots. So for me, it was actually a bit of maybe a reverse experience where the roots trip came first before I had done a lot of research myself. So how my first roots trip came to pass was in 2008, and I was living in Guangzhou, and my mom came to visit me, and as she visited, when she arrived, she just said, "Hey, did you actually know that we have a very, very distant cousin in Xiamen, which is also in southern China?" And I said, "No." And she said, "Well, it's not too far. So if you want to go, we're in contact now, and we can maybe just visit him." So that's what we did. It was just very impromptu, and we just figured, "Oh, it's pretty cool. Let's find this. Let's visit this distant cousin of ours." And when we were there, another surprise just came up, was put on the table, and that's when the cousin said, "Hey, did you actually know where our ancestors came from?" So this is the branch of my mom's maternal grandmother. And we, of course, said no, we had no idea. And then he said, "Well, hop in the car and I'll take you there." So that's really how it started. So in terms of the why and the expectations that I had, I really went with an extremely open mind because it was just laid out for me as a present. And that also, I think, allowed me to really suck everything in with a blank slate, so no expectations, and allowing myself to be positively overwhelmed with what I saw, and then sort of the images that I had about the ancestors living there. So the pictures that I dropped were from that very first root strips. It was the first of quite a lot to follow to other branches, and of course with my China Roots customers too.
Jeremy, do you want to give some intro for yourself?
Yeah, sure. Hi, everyone. My name is Jeremy, and I'm one of the mods here on the My China Roots server. And on my first Roots trip actually was all the way back in 2005. I was 15 at the time when I first went back with my family. We took a family trip back to China. It was about 12 of us. And one of the stops that we made was back to Toisan. And we visited my grandfather's village. But little did I know at the time, because I really didn't know a lot about my family history at the time. I really heard just bits and pieces of my family history, but nothing really too concrete in terms of like village names or names of my great great grandparents. And my family never really talked about it all too much. So when I went back in 2005, I actually visited my grandfather's adopted village, and that's when I came to know that he was actually sold as a child at age 7. So he was born in a village, and then at age 7, his family, due to poverty and due to the nature of what was going on politically and just everything in China at the time. There was a lot of destitution. And because of that, he was sold to another family because they needed the money to pay for his birth father's medication as he was sick at the time. So he ended up being sold off to a Chin family, hence my last name. And that is the village that I ended up visiting. And my grandfather never really told me much about his birth family at that time. And I think because I was only 15 at the time, I really didn't have much of an appreciation for my cultural heritage since I was so young, and I didn't really know exactly what it meant to be Chinese or Chinese American. And it really took me quite a while until after I graduated from college and I was well into my career that I decided that it was time for me to be the one in the family to really start, this research, because I always had that curiosity, but I never really knew where to start. And I think it was about the year of 2016 is when I moved into, so I'm originally from New Jersey, but then in 2016 I moved into New York and I ended up living in Chinatown. And around that time was when two of my living grandparents at the time both got into accidents. And I think at that time, once those accidents occurred, and they were both in their early 90s at the time, I said to myself, nobody really knows anything about our family history. And because of those, two freak accidents, I was like, if my grandparents pass away, then all of that information dies with them, and nobody will know anything about our family history that, goes back thousands of years. And I think it was at that point that I decided that I wanted to start doing some of this research on my family and be the one in the family that collected, all the research and really, tried to find out as much as I could about my grandparents' histories. And then I ended up finding out from doing a lot of this research that I was actually a fourth generation Chinese American immigrant into this country. And my great great grandfather on my paternal great great grandfather on my paternal grandmother's side was the first person to come into this country. So the picture that I posted in the chat is a picture of my great great grandfather who first came to this country in Colusa, California, all the way back in the 1870s. So that is a picture from his immigration file that I was able to obtain from the National Archives, which is a fantastic resource if any of you have ancestors that came here in the 1800s and the early 1900s. Their immigration files are, very possibly in the National Archives, and you can request those. So, this is kind of what kind of started my research is to really, take a look at all of this information and see how much I can find on the internet since I wasn't, at that point to go to China, at the time. And so after doing all this research and then, talking to my grandfather and my grandmother and trying to get as much information from them, as I could about their family histories, and try and talk to them, while they still could remember as much as they could, I was able to compile a lot of information in regards to where my village was. and the names of my ancestors, and just little bits and pieces of the story that I can try and fit together like puzzle pieces. And then come 2016, I ended up attending a Chinese genealogy conference that they were holding in New York, in Chinatown, New York. And it was at that point when I learned about the Friends of Roots program. And the Friends of Roots program is basically a program that's been operational for over 30 years now, and they take groups of people back to China to visit their ancestral roots. And when I first heard of that program, I was very interested because I was like, this could be my opportunity to be able to go back on a guided tour back to my ancestral villages and really be able to see all of this research that I'm doing right now and see that face to face in person, and have everything really, as we're calling this, come full circle. So in 2018, I made the leap to apply to the Friends of Roots program. And it was that year that I ended up going back to China and visited a whole bunch of my ancestral villages there. And yeah, it was a extremely, extremely transformative experience to really just take everything that I've, worked on for so many years and be able to kind of see everything in its real form back where it all started.
Ooh, so many full circles that you've gone through. Thanks for sharing, Jeremy. For me, similarly, I also grew up in New Jersey, but my parents are from Malaysia. And so I grew up with this sense of having a very Malaysian Chinese sense of Chinese identity. And my mom is the youngest of 9 children, and my dad also has a lot of siblings. So we just had a very big family scattered everywhere around the world. So I knew I had a large family, but I didn't necessarily feel close. And for me, it was in 2018 when I took the leap to move to China to explore more of like what that means on my own terms, and ran into my China roots and had their support to go on my own trip to my grandfather's village, specifically my mother's father's village in Fujian. And what was interesting is that I'd actually gone before in 2006 when I was about 12 years old. And I'm going to drop a couple of pictures of little preteen me. That's me and my brother on the right side. And I have mainly like 2 main memories from that trip. I discovered that I have a niece who was older than me. So that's the girl in the orange shirt with the penguin on it. I was like, how am I an aunt? I'm only 12 years old and my niece is like 20 or something. Like, how does that work? I don't understand family trees. And then the other thing we got to do was pay respects to the graves, the tombstones of my great grandparents here. And they're carved in the shape of an armchair. But that was something I didn't know until I went back in 2018 on my trip with my China roots to the village. And so I will share more stories as we go through, but one thing that was cool is we found the same grave 12 years later, and the place had become quite overgrown, as you can see. But it was really cool to go back with my own questions, my own curiosity, and this time with the support of a lot of relatives and also research support from my China roots. So that was very healing for the sense of like disconnect I had growing up, where family's kind of everywhere but nowhere at the same time. Yeah, so that's some intro context for me. What were some of the fears, right? Were some of the insecurities that you felt about the prospect of undertaking like such a trip? Like Jeremy, why did you reach out to Friends of Roots, right? Like Huihan, what were steps that you took in designing your trips to help make up for or give that sense of support for the ways that you felt uncertain going in?
Yeah, so one of the big reasons that I went through the Friends of Roots program is because going into this, even though I've done so much research, so much digital research and internet research on my family history, I didn't know a single thing about planning a trip to go to China. especially if I was going to do something like that myself and be like, oh, I'm just going to book a flight to Taishan, and then I'm going to just go in there and I'm going to find my village, and then it's going to be a 1, 2, 3 process, and it's not. And it's something that I had no idea about. And Friends of Roots just made it, so easy because, they were just a big support system. And the people at Friends of Roots, for instance, the co-founder of Friends of Roots, Al Chang, he's just a great mentor and a great leader. He's been doing these trips for 30 years. So when I heard that he's been doing these trips for so long and taking groups of young people back to China, I knew I was in good hands to be able to get that support, to be able to know that they're going to guide me through the whole process. They're going to be able to help me, feel comfortable both emotionally and both, physically on the ground there. And, they were able to kind of, plan the whole itinerary of the trip. They were able to make sure that we had transportation going to all the different villages, and itinerary planned out so that, we really didn't have to do a lot of that planning. And one of the other fears was the language, since I really don't speak much Chinese at all. So it was really helpful to be able to have, Al as a translator, to be able to help, walk me through these villages and talk to the people there, and they would help translate. And then we also had some academic researchers from Guangzhou University that were on our trip as well, that was helping with planning the trip and helping with translating and coordinating so many things. And, a lot of those fears of, the language issues, and am I going to be able to adapt, to the culture, which is, so much, different, from mine here in America. And also even going into the villages and potentially meeting relatives. I had that fear of, oh, if I end up meeting relatives here, are they going to, be those types of people that, oh, this guy is from America and he has money, so they're going to try and just like ask me for money, and then that was going to be the interaction I would have with people. So a lot of those fears that I have, but going, with the Friends of Roots program really kind of put those fears at bay, and allowed me to, to be able to sit with those fears, but also to be able to be, open to anything that could happen, and to not necessarily have expectations, and to be able to be open to whatever happens.
Yeah, for me, I think I was really lucky with that first experience, where my distant cousin just took us to the village, and of course, because he'd already been there, it was very smooth, and that gave me maybe a naive sense of confidence going forward when I started doing other branches of our family's research. I still remember though, around 2009 2010, when I was tracing our paternal lineage, I had a couple good clues of about the place where we were from, based on the tombstone of my great grandfather in Indonesia, and had some contact with people on the ground there. And I thought, okay, I'm gonna go. I do remember fearing, what would they think of me? I'm just gonna be this stranger just showing up, and I felt it's maybe a bit like it's a blind date with family history, right? Well, what if things are bad and I'll be stuck there, and I'll be there. I'll have taken a plane down there. I'll still be there for a day. It'll just be awkward, So, yeah, those were things on my mind. Language too, and even though I did speak some Chinese, at least enough to have chats with people in the village, I did think, well, I'm not 100% sure whether this is my village. So how will I really know if people can tell me anything? How will I know that it's really my village? And funnily enough, this village was on the island of Jinmen, just off the coast of Xiamen. And to make a long story short, it actually ended up not being my ancestral village. But I didn't know that until way into the village trip, and I was only sure that it wasn't after I came back home to Beijing. In the meantime, we were received with all kinds of fanfare. I remember taking the boat from Xiamen, and we were docking, and I saw this row of people, journalists, and a big camera watching the boat come in. And yeah, they basically, the local historian that I had been in touch with, of course, they notified the media, and then the mayor showed up to receive the lost son who returned home after 8 generations of being abroad, and all of that. There was a whole story. It was a whole circus, and yeah, when then we went to the village, and then of course, like I said, after I went home, I did more double checking and verifying, and then it appeared not to be the right village at all. So you could say the initial fears were actually then well founded. I'm still happy that I went, though, just to get the initial experience of going to a place and just being a detective, I guess. But yeah, those were key concerns. I know a lot of people have fears and concerns about, for instance, what do the villagers want from me? I think, especially in the 90s, when China was a lot poorer economically, it was very often the case that when a visiting family would come from the US or Southeast Asia, that the family would be appreciative of donations and money. And to a large extent, if you look at it historically, that's also not strange, because the ancestors of the people who go on the route trip, they typically went outside across the ocean in order to make money for the family back home. Very often, the family back home, the wider family, would actually pool financial resources so that they would send one person abroad. So from a conceptual point of view and a bigger family point of view, that makes sense. But of course, from the visiting family point of view, you might just think that's annoying. I do have to say that with China's economic growth since the 90s, that dynamic has changed. And for instance, in Guangdong, what we see is very often, very bluntly put, that the hosting family, so the family that's stayed behind in China, is doing extremely well, and very often, like, economically better than the visiting family, and there's absolutely no need for financial aid at all. And it's very often the other way around. Like, they're extremely generous in hosting banquets and all of that. Yeah, I mean, let me just stop there. I think those are some key fears.
One of the things that came up as Huihan was sharing for me is, I think, definitely the language barrier and some of the cultural gaps. Like, will I be welcome? Will I be well received? Even though my Mandarin isn't like the best. And also, besides Mandarin, right, there's like a bunch of local dialects varieties that people speak, whether it's Cantonese or Hokkien, for my villages in Guangzhou and Fujian. So I was worried about that. But honestly, like, I think there's something quite beautiful about how, when you don't have words to speak, you find other ways to communicate. And so even just, from the get-go, like, the ways that the actions, right, that people show love, smiling, like trying to carry, like fighting with you to carry your luggage and load it into the car, blessing you with like a lot of food, so much food, all the food. And so I think things like that definitely made me feel like, okay, any doubt I have about, belonging to this family, or like not knowing enough, not being able to speak enough. I think they were just very like happy that, okay, you're back, right? And on my trip, I had a friend who joined, who's actually on the call, AK, and she told me about this proverb that goes like, on every journey, you must die once. The person who leaves must not be the same as the one who arrives. And I kind of had this moment on the trip where I heard these stories where my grandfather had, left and had like planted a tree in his home that was supposed to signify like, as long as this tree grows, this will measure the time until I come home. But he ended up making his life like in his home in Malaysia, and he came back for a few visits, but he never really like came back. And so for me coming back, I was like, wow, I feel like just generationally, there's this I feel like I'm almost like returning or almost fulfilling his wish to return on his behalf. Yeah, and so moments like that where I was like, it doesn't matter if I return or not. Yeah, there were moments like that where I realized, okay, yeah, this does matter, not just for me, but for my ancestors, past, present, and future. For me personally, it's really important to document experiences. Super into photography, and I'm like a filmmaker by training, and so I was like, how do I go into this trip and document all of it, but also give myself the space to be present and soak up and experience everything, without being behind the camera all the time. When I expressed this concern, I remember talking with Huihan, actually, was we were planning my trip, and he was like, what if we bring some people along who can help you document so you don't have to worry about it. And I was like, I didn't realize that was an option. And so, yeah, we, reached out, brought my friend AK and another videographer, and they just took care of photographing and videographing everything for me. And I could just soak it all up and not worry about having to be everywhere at once. So, it's good to pinpoint like what are things you're worried about and like how do you want to feel on this trip? Because especially if you are the primary like family historian or detective in your family and you're the one who's like trying to get everyone to go, right? A lot of the planning responsibilities like will naturally kind of come down to you, but you want to make sure that on the trip, like you yourself have the space and the time and the energy to fully experience it, mind, body, and soul for yourself. So for me, that looked like, bringing people who can document on my behalf so I could just enjoy everything. But yeah, that might look different for you. I feel like, Huihan, it'd be cool if you could share the story of like Leslie's example and the ways that people process it differently, and also, of course, anything else you want to add.
Yeah, so many things. I mean, first of all, I think it's so important what you just said in terms of having support, because if you're doing it all alone, if doing it all alone, I mean, if you're the key person for the traveling group to organize the trip in advance, to have done some of the research in advance, and then during the trip to be a guide as well as the key communicating person, as well as a key documenting person, there's really not a lot of brain space for yourself to actually experience the trip. And I had that issue with several trips. Even though I'm really grateful that different family members on different trips could come with me to different ancestral villages, it was quite full on for my own brain space to translate and to take care of the logistics, to take care that everybody is okay on the host side as well as the visiting group side. So yeah, I really had to sort of step back during the trip and just sort of be alone a bit and just let things process and then think, okay, yeah, what is this? What have I just actually seen in terms of a new finding or a tombstone, or what does it mean and how does it link back to me? Because that requires a lot of brain and heart space to process all the information that you get on a route trip. It's extremely overwhelming, even if you have a support group. So yeah, I think that was a really important point that you just mentioned. One other thing that I was before going into the Leslie story about fears, I also remember before going on my first own roots trip, thinking, well, I don't really. How should I behave? Like, what type of cultural? There must be a lot of cultural etiquette and norms that I don't know about, having grown up in Europe. And yeah, I don't want to upset anybody, and I don't really know I just don't really know how to behave. And one thing I learned though, just going, and that was one of the reasons why I also came back being so inspired, is the lesson that at the end of the day, we're all human beings, and at the end of the day, we all have our intuitions, and you can feel from somebody's vibe, from the way they look, from their body language, whether they appreciate you or things in general or not. Of course, culture is important. Of course, there are a lot of little rules that people are used to, what it means to pay respect, and there are a lot of different ways you can act that out. But at the end of the day, that shouldn't be a barrier to actually going and making the leap to visit your ancestral village, because at the end of the day, they can see in your eyes that what you're experiencing. And no matter the educational level, I think, at least in my experience, people will get that other people might not be the same as them, and they will feel when something is true and honest and has integrity, like a visitor who acts a bit different from them. So yeah, that was just very powerful to me too. The fact that we are just people who are being reunited and connecting, and that does supersede cultural norms and behaviors.
We have a quick question in the chat before we dive into Leslie's story from Jisan. Like, does there still need to be letters of invitation from a village before a visit can be done?
The short answer, I would say, is no needed. I mean, there's a there's a I guess the legal / visa point of view. There's a personal point of view of being received and planning, and that's more a personal and logistical perspective. And there's maybe a political point of view, but that's also related to a visa, I guess. I mean, the short answer is just no. You can visit. I mean, you can, if you have a visa for China, you can just travel in China. I would very strongly recommend to be in touch with the village before you arrive, and maybe even more from a personal and emotional point of view than from any other point of view, because that just makes your trip a lot easier logistically, also emotionally. If they are prepared, that just works better for you, because you can just dive into getting to know each other a bit quicker. Who told you to get the letter?
In 2016, when Dad was still alive, he took the brothers, so his sons, back. And I don't know, because he's passed away now in 2018, and he did all the organising. And
so maybe
so I'm not sure. I'm not sure why, because I think he was 5 when he went to Hong Kong. So I'm not sure whether, and we're in Australia, so whether that was something to do with visa or we just don't know.
I'm speculating now, but maybe it could have been that your dad organized it through the Chinese Affairs Office, the Qiaoban or the Qiaolian, so that these are government institutions that help overseas Chinese return. And then, maybe they would. It was they said that, and then it's not so much a legal requirement, but in order for them to help you, and in order for them to to be indeed. To be sure that you are who you say you are. I think maybe it was that element.
Makes sense. Cool. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. So the issue of different personalities, different expectations, different ways of experiencing a road trip. One eye-opening moment was when I took an American / Dominican Republic family back to their ancestral village in Kaiping in Seyap in Zhongmen. And it was on the visiting family side, there were 3 generations. There was a grandmother, a mother, and the grandkids. And so in setting it up, I was already aware that those three generations had pretty different expectations, which is fine, right? But the grandmother came at it from a very emotional point of view. It was her father who was stillborn in China, and she just wanted to be reunited. For her, it was a very emotional issue of just being back together, with the people of the environment that her dad was born in. For the daughter, so the mom, the middle generation, middle-aged, and she took the the initiative of organizing everything. For her, it was much more an intellectual endeavor and a rational endeavor. She wanted to understand. She grew up with a grandfather who was very stoic, who never really talked about anything, let alone about the softer side of things or the more emotional side of roots. So she just wanted to see what it was like and to understand what happened and what made her grandfather leave. And the kids were basically too young; they were just playing. But then, when we arrived, there was this moment of awkwardness, because when we arrived in the village and the hosting family, so the family, the Chinese side of the family, were there. We got off the bus, and the grandmother, I remember, she already had tears in her eyes and she was already very emotional during the bus ride. So coming out of the bus, she was just waiting to give the biggest hug ever to all her reconnected family in Kaiping. And rather than those hugs coming to pass, basically the cousin went straight to the bus to get the luggage, and just basically everybody on the Chinese side was much more concerned with the practical things and logistics and just making sure they got on the car okay. And there was no hug. And there was it was definitely a bit awkward in the first 5 minutes. But then after 15 minutes or half an hour, of course, the ice is broken, and then and then it sort of goes back to my earlier point of, at the end, we are all just people, and everybody just has a different way of dealing with situations that are emotional. So in this particular case, on the Chinese side, they wanted to express their gratitude and their appreciation and their happiness by making sure that everything was okay logistically, by making sure that their suitcases would be immediately taken care of and were safe and secure in the car, by making sure that the food was ready at home and all the chairs were nicely lined up. And it's a different approach, and obviously none is better than the other. It's just different. And that was just very interesting to see. And I think that's also good to remind yourself of if you're going on a roots trip. So, remind yourself or ask yourself, why am I doing this? What are my expectations? And just to be, also remind yourself that the other people that you'll be meeting, they'll have their points of view of how things will go and how things feel.
Jeremy, I was curious if there were any moments that came up for you that were like kind of awkward or kind of uncomfortable, right? Or what was that showed you the contrast between a very kind of healing experience versus one where maybe there were still a lot of questions left unanswered.
I think it was very much a journey, and I think for myself, I was able to adapt pretty well to like the cultural aspect of things. And when I got into the villages, everything was all very new, since I didn't really have much experience visiting a village apart from the first time that I went in 2005. And a bunch of the places that I went to, especially for my villages, we met a bunch of people in a lot of these villages that were distant family members, but not necessarily close family members. So it was always hard to be able to figure out who these people were and what their relationship was, to me. And all I knew, like in my paternal grandmother's village, that the person that had the keys to my great grandfather's house, all I knew was that he was the one that had the keys. I had no idea, how he was related, and all anyone said was that he was a cousin of some sort. So there was a lot of that, going around in a lot of the villages that, I visited, even for my other fellow rooters that I went on this trip with. We were meeting a lot of, relatives that, we didn't really know who they were. And that's where, it was important if we were able to find a family tree book that we can actually, take a look at that family tree book, and they can identify, our relatives in that book to be able to see where we fit in the grand scheme of the village family. So I think that was something that was important to kind of secure that, oh, like, and make us really feel like this is our village. Once we were able to look at that family tree book and be able to trace up and say, that is my grandfather's name, and there are my great grandfather's name in this book. And then that's kind of sometimes for a lot of people was kind of that moment where they were like, okay, so I finally found the village and this is it.
You bring up this family tree book, which in Chinese genealogy is called the zupu, and that is one of the holy grails, we like to say, of Chinese genealogy that we always hope can be found on a village visit. Kind of building off of what Jeremy was saying, for planning your own trip and designing like just where you want to go, it's important to figure out, like, of course, identifying your village, but within your village, there are different traces that you can still see, right? There's the ancestral hall or the clan hall, the temple for your surname clan. Perhaps your family has like an ancestral house that's left behind. So for mine, within the house, I was able to see like portraits, ancestral portraits of my great-grandparents. I was able to find letters that my grandfather had written and sent back, and they had kept and received after all these years. Even like newspaper clippings of my grandmother's obituary from when she passed away in Malaysia that they mailed back to China to let them know. So yeah, so that's the house. And of course, graves. Maybe you want to pay respects to the tombs of any ancestors who are around there. So these are a couple of the destinations within the village itself as a destination to keep in mind. And also within the hall, I should say, oftentimes in a clan, there's what's called like a zupu keeper, like a keeper of the records. And so it's important to try and like get in touch ahead of time with any members of the local clan association, so they know you're coming and they can prepare any copies of the zupu that you might want to see, or maybe they're more modern now and they've like started to digitize their zupu and they might have an extra copy for you to take home with you. That was true in my case. But yeah, so within Ancestral Village, there are a couple of destinations like that to keep in mind.
I just wanted to add on to that really quickly. So as you do your research and as you kind of talk to your family members and you hear stories, especially of the older generation, if you're talking to the older generation and hearing stories about, their lives back in the village, or you're reading through immigration documents and you're reading through the interrogation interviews, if your ancestors were paper sons and they're talking about the village and your different kind of key things in the village, that's another way where you'll be able to find specific things that you might want to, look for in the village. Or if you find a name that's in the immigration files, you can, go back to the village and ask about those specific people and see if they know of them, so on and so forth. So, for instance, in my case, my grandfather always talked about his father-in-law and his father-in-law's father, that when he came to Colusa, California, all the money that he made here through his general merchandising store, he sent back to the village to build a watchtower. And all that money that he made here, he sent back for that purpose. So when I went back to that village, that was one of the things that I was really looking to see, because I heard that was, this landmark as a part of, the stories that I heard. So I was able to go back, and it was kind of in that other picture that I showed you before, but this is the watchtower in my paternal grandmother's village that my great-great-grandfather was able to build with the money that he sent back from working in America. So just one of the kind of specifics that, I was really looking for when I went back.
Yeah, just a little thing to add about Japus and Zupus, because Shirley was also just mentioning in the chat about her family book and how there was none in the village. So very often they are in a village, but often they're also not in a village anymore. And that can have different reasons why there might not be a Japu in the village. There are also many cases where there might not be a Japu in the village, but it might be elsewhere. So, for instance, we've found quite a lot of Japus at clan associations, museum collections, even overseas. There was a we did a trip once, and somebody from Indonesia and Taiwan actually. And then in the village there was no clan book anymore. Then they went home, and then actually a couple of weeks after that, we ended up finding their zupu in Singapore, and it was at a clan association in Singapore. So it was basically a situation where a sibling of or another relative of the clan had left for Singapore instead of going to Indonesia, and they had brought a copy over from China to Singapore and then left it there. So yeah, if it's not in the village, don't lose hope, because there are quite a few other places where it could well be.
Yeah, when I went to one of my villages and I was asking about the family tree book, and the people there had no idea where it was. They were like, "I'm not sure where it is. You know, it was definitely written at one point in time, but we're not sure who has it." And then I ended up talking to one of my family members who was connected to some extended family members, and apparently my great grandfather on my maternal grandmother's side, actually, when he left from China and moved out, to the West, he ended up taking the Japu with him. And I'm still trying to track that down, but presumably the Japu is somewhere in the middle of Saskatchewan, Canada, where some of my family had immigrated to. And I'm trying to see if I can get in touch with some of those relatives to see if it was actually hand carried out into Canada, so that it could be preserved and how I can take a look at it.
Yeah.
Yeah, I love those examples of alternate routes. And I mean, honestly, the route trip in itself can be amazing, but one thing we want to emphasize is that it's one step, of many steps that you've taken and you will take in your roots journey. And there's still a lot more that can happen, beyond the roots trip. And, you can do multiple roots trips too. And so, yeah, I would love to kind of, open the floor for those of you who have gone on roots trips, right, to share in the chat. From going on trips, how has that affected you, your research, maybe, but even your relationship with family members, with yourself? I know for me, I definitely had this sense of almost like coming home to myself, and this feeling of oh, wow, even just the sights and the sounds and the smells of being in my grandfather's hometown, it was very similar to everything I associate with Malaysia, which my parents did bring me back to a lot growing up. But I never understood the history of how they're connected with each other. So to go in person, just let myself be oh my gosh, actually, the food I love in Malaysia, a lot of it comes from my grandfather's hometown. The humidity, it's the same. My hair is just as frizzy here as it is there. And the last photo I posted where I'm sitting on the floor in front of the temple, that particular picture I really love, because it almost had a very spiritual feeling. The atrium was just wide open to the sky. There were all these bonsai trees kind of lining the courtyard. And it was interesting because the temple right above it was another related temple, but you can kind of see it's very very colorful, very loud, very almost over the top. And the feeling I had in both places, I felt perfectly captured the contrast of identity crisis versus feeling at ease, where the colorful temple was oh, look at me, I need to prove, I'm super awesome, and I need to prove that I am Chinese and this is what it means, just very loud and assertive in that way. Whereas how I felt in the last temple, all the decorations were just black and gold and just very wide open, very quiet, very serene. And it was just this sense of I'm royalty and I know it, and I don't need to prove it or show it to anyone. I just am. And our stories, told and untold, they are beautiful just the way they are. And yeah, and I don't need to question it or feel, I have to constantly try to prove it. And so, yeah, that was a thing that I will remember and still carry with me. What about you, Huihan and Jeremy? What were those moments for you?
When you just, the food, I think a lot of people have different experiences and different things that trigger basically a reaction of feeling at ease and feeling full circle. But when you just were talking about your food experience in the village, my dad had exactly the same. So we'd arrived and it was already 2 hours in, and he was a bit quiet, I felt. And then we had lunch, and he sort of lit up immediately, and he was just going on about the noodles, the Hokkien noodles, and because it just really reminded him of his childhood. And so the situation is that my dad was born in Indonesia, but it was the ancestors 5 generations before him who made it over to Indonesia. So he had never, been to China, and none of my family really speaks Chinese. So for him to have this link through food of his childhood, that really made him connect with the ancestral village in China. Because I think up until then, everything felt rather abstract for him and distant, like emotionally, and also because there was a language barrier. But when he put that first bite of noodles in his mouth, I remember just seeing his reaction, and his whole body language exploded like positively, and he sprung up, and his eyes started, there was a twinkle. So yeah, for me personally, I also remember like in that first road trip in 2008, where I went with my mom. The trip was pretty much laid out for us. The key trigger moment was standing in front of the ancestral altar. For me, I just remember standing there and thinking, 7 generations ago, my great-great-great-great-great-grandfather stood in front of this exact same altar with, on probably within a square meter, the exact same place as where I'm standing. And his view would have been the same as my view right now of, the ancestral tablets of the first person who set foot in that village. And that really, it triggered an emotion and an experience. And it was that experience that made me feel, wow, I'm here. I'm also part of history. I'm not just disconnected and doing things in daily life like a job or anything. I'm actually part of history and part of this world. And it felt as if a cycle of history was closing itself, and it just felt round and peaceful and at ease. And I think for a lot of people, they have those moments at different points of the overall journey. So going back to, for instance, Leslie's trip, the Dominican Republic / American family, for her, the trigger moment came actually a week or 2 weeks after she had returned to the US. And she just saw, I think it was a picture of a relative. It wasn't even a picture of a relative that was directly linked to what we had seen in China. But it was something that superficially might be random, but it just triggered something in her mind. And she broke down and cried in the kitchen, she said, 2 weeks after the trip. For other people, it's, I think Jeremy mentioned it earlier, just seeing the family tree, seeing names in a diapo. I remember an Australian customer that we helped visit his ancestral village. It was, the trip was all fine, but it wasn't until he saw the name of his grandfather written down and as part of a larger structure of a family tree that made him basically feel the experience of yes, this is where my family was from, and now I'm back. So yeah, there's I think Jeremy, for you that was to do with the watchtower, right? That your grandfather was.
There were a couple of kind of trigger moments and full circle moments for me. So one was the watchtower, because that was such a important historical piece in my family's history, and being able to climb to the top of that watchtower. And I just posted a picture of the view from that watchtower that overlooked the fields and the village, and just being able to just be there and just be at peace being up there, and knowing that my ancestors had walked where I was, and it was just a surreal experience just to really be there. And then I think the other kind of trigger point and full circle moment was with my grandfather's village. So, as I was saying before, that my grandfather never really wanted to talk about his birth village because it was such a traumatic experience in his life to be ripped away from his family, at the age of 7 and sold to another family with no choice. And because of that, he held so much pain from that, and he never, wanted to talk about it at all. And when he knew that I was going back, to China to, explore my roots and explore the villages, he said, I don't know if you should go back because I don't want you to be disappointed if you go back. And because one of my real goals for this trip was to see if I can find his birth family. And because he never really wanted to talk about it, but it was a part of his life. And I thought that if I can connect him back with, that family, it would be kind of a full circle moment for him. And he had told me, I don't think you should go back. I think that all of those people in my family have died because, there was so much poverty there that I don't think anyone survived. And, I was like, I understand your reservations. This is still something that I want to do, if not for you, then for myself. And so, when I ended up going back to the village, and as we were, approaching the village in our van, so the leader of our group, Al Cheng, he was in contact with some people from the village administration office, and apparently they had told him that there are some people that wanted to meet with me. And they had no idea who they were. They didn't know if they were family members. They didn't know if they were just people in the village that might have known, who my grandfather was. And then at that point is where some of those fears of like, oh, are these people that are just going to be claiming that they're my family just so, that they could say that they're family in America and try and get money out of me. So I think, on that ride to the village, I had a lot of kind of like fears going through my head. But then, Al was, very quick to tell me to just don't have any, expectations. Let go of the expectations and just experience for what it is, and just have an open mind for whatever comes that will come. And then once I actually got into the village, we ended up going to the village administration office. And we went to like the third floor of this office, and there was this long boardroom, and me and all the other people from my trip were on one side of the boardroom, and then there were these 4 or 5 people that ended up coming into the room and were standing on the other side of the boardroom, on the other side of this table. And, it was the next, like, 30 minutes was spent trying to figure out who these people were. And we ended up, finding out from having conversations with these people that the people that were there that came all the way from Macau to come and see me ended up being my grandfather's direct nieces and nephews. And I ended up having the names of my grandfather's birth brothers and sisters because he had ended up giving those names to me before I went on my trip. And then I showed those names to the people on the other side of that table, and they pointed to one of the names and was like, "Oh, that's my father." And there was just like a series of events after that that just really kind of like were those trigger moments that were like, this is real and this is happening, and something that I never thought in a million years would happen, that I would be able to find my grandfather's birth family. And this is all coming to light here. And one of the things that they ended up sharing with me when I was there, so they ended up giving me this letter that they had, and what they had told me was, this is a letter that your grandfather sent to his birth mother over 80 years ago. And this was the last communication that anybody in this family has had with your grandfather. And
That was
it
after
was
the
just,
adoption.
yeah, this is after the adoption, and after I was able to get, someone to translate the document for me. This was actually a letter that was sent to his mother while he was in America, and it was
Wow.
shortly after, he ended up, he was in World War II, in the Army Air Force, and after he came back from the war is when he sent this letter in the early 1930s, or the probably no mid to late 1930s. He sent that to his mother, and it basically he was telling his mother that he's doing okay, in America here, but he's still feeling a lot of immense pain about the whole situation of being sold into this, other family. And it was just kind of like pouring out of his heart and how he was feeling and how hurt he was. And it was just such a raw, expose that I was able to read, from my grandfather. And I think
Yeah.
at that point it became more real because I was able to send that to my grandfather, and he was able to see his signature, on the last page. And I was like, this was just, incredible that like they kept this letter. And one of the things they told me was, that we kept this letter for, over 80 years because we were looking for your grandfather ever since. We can never find him, and now
So
you're
what was
here.
his reaction in the end?
His reaction, I think it took, a while for him to really kind of understand what actually had happened and kind of process everything, from my trip. Because, another thing was that they actually had a picture of my grandfather in a photo album that they had on the wall that he had sent to his mother over 80 years ago. So if you could see the picture of the young guy in the middle on the left there in the button down shirt, that's my grandfather. And I looked at his face and I was like, that looks like my grandfather. And just like all those different, like, little, not little things, but different kind of like touch points that really the letter and then the picture and the photo, and then finding, my grandfather's, father and his siblings in the family tree book, and all those things really kind of just over the course of that day, just like, really solidified that, wow, this is real. And you know, I'm home, in a sense. And once I got back from my trip, and I kind of, had a big debrief with my grandfather, and I was showing him all these pictures. And, I shared with him the letter, and he looked at it and he was like, this looks like what I wrote. And then finally, I was able to get him onto WeChat because the relatives over there were very, very interested in communicating with him. And they wanted to let him know that they've been thinking about him all these years and they never forgot about him all these years. And they wanted to let him know that his pain and hurt and suffering, wasn't for nothing. And then they never forgot about that. And fortunately, I was able to get him onto WeChat, and he's been communicating, with these relatives ever since. And I think been a homecoming for him in a sense, and a full circle moment for him, because I think he's finally been able to find peace, in his heart, because now he knows that his birth family is alive and well. And there's over like 100 family members, on his side of the family there that, for all these years we never knew existed. And now, he's, messaging with them over WeChat every single day. And it's just incredible that he's really been able to come, to terms with, how he was feeling about the situation and really find that peace within himself to really kind of close that loop. And yeah.
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 Mind-blowing story. Yeah. Well, it also goes to show, right, that the root strip is as great and magnificent as it is. It's one block in a larger, or one. It happens in a larger context, right? And after you've done the trip, things are not over. It's not sort of been there, done that. It's can can be healing for other people in your family. It can be, it can help to involve others and get more interested. I mean, one thing that I also like after one of the trips with my paternal line, basically then the family members came over from Fujian and visited me and stayed with us for about a week in Beijing, and just having those ties continue. That was just absolutely wonderful. So this is a dinner at our dinner table in Beijing. And then especially having my kids, so my kids are now 6 and 8. This is, 2 years ago. They have see the kids play together. That was emotional too. Because that's, what better definition of a full circle to see the new generation than just be completely innocent, having fun on the street playing together.
Oh yeah, just the last thing I was going to add, one of the craziest things that I ended up finding out once we got into the village, and they were like, "Oh, so your grandfather has a nephew and he lives in Brooklyn." And I was like, "My grandfather was living in Brooklyn for a majority of his life, and now we're finding out that he has a direct nephew that lives in Brooklyn." So I think the other full circle moment was once I got back to New York, and that's a picture of my grandfather there, and was able to meet one of his birth relatives, his nephew, flesh and blood. And that also was just a really, really incredible moment.
Thank you both for sharing. I'm like getting chills. I still have so many chills. Hearing all the circles that, your curiosity kind of opens, and then you discover down the line that you're kind of closing almost like a unfulfilled or open question, right, from the previous generation in the process. And so the last picture I just posted, these are relatives who are still in our village. And ever since that trip, we've been talking about, it would be so great to do a huge, like, giant family reunion, like bring everyone overseas, like back to China together, and catch up. And of course, pandemic has happened, right? And travel to China has been very difficult, still is very difficult right now. And so, one thing we would like to close on is what are some action steps you can start taking right now to still prepare and make the most of your trip when travel makes it possible. And so, a couple that come to my mind are doing the research. If you don't know your village, this is a great time to make use of our Discord community here. We have a lot of channels that can help you figure out, like, what is my Romanized surname and convert that into the Chinese character, which will be important for tracking down what is the village, what are the records in Chinese that match your family. And besides, like, research, think about, like, who do you want to go on the trip with you, right? Is this something that you want to kind of do by yourself, right? Do with your immediate family, invite other relatives to, invite some grandparents, right? If they're still able to fly. Do you want to bring friends, right? Like, who do you want to share this with? What kind of support do you need? Of course, there are trips that My China Roots helps organize. And we'll send a roots guide with you to help with not just like translating, but also navigating a lot of the cultural gaps and what are things that your relatives might say and do that might be different from how you're used to, and just kind of standing in that gap. And besides that, like, whatever findings that you have so far, do what you can to share them with your family, like get them as excited and engaged as you are, because the more, they understand like why this matters, who they're going to meet, what might possibly be waiting for them back home, quote unquote, right? Even if they feel like it's their home or not. All of those things to help liven up their curiosity will just make the experience, far more meaningful for everyone who ultimately gets to go when the time comes. Are there any other tips or advice you'd like to offer, Jeremy, Huihan, and of course anyone in the chat?
No, I think you covered it pretty well, Chrislyn. One takeaway really is have a support group and prepare well. And even though travel is not feasible at the moment, it will at some point. and it's never too early to start preparing. And again, yeah, this is about your ancestral village. What do you know about what traces are where? Is there a zupu or a zupu? Where would it be? Family members in the village. What is still left from the traces of when your ancestor was still in China? All of those questions you could, if you haven't started it yet, it's never too early to start or too late.
The research aspect is so important because you don't have to, be in China to be able to do that. There's so many resources, online that you can utilize to be able to conduct research and find information about your ancestors, especially if they have immigrated over here early on in the, 20th or 19th century. There's a lot of databases like Ancestry.com or FamilySearch.com where you can find ship manifests of your ancestors coming over to the United States. And like I mentioned before, you can find those immigration records from the National Archives that holds a lot of key information to the experiences of your ancestors coming here to the U.S. And also, talking to your family members. And if you have any family members of the older generation, try to talk to those members of the older generation as early as possible, because you never know when they're going to start forgetting things and when they're not going to remember, oh, what was the name of the village or what was the name of their grandfather. So the earlier that you can really start having those conversations and trying to get as much information as you can, while, their mind may be sharp and they might have stories to tell. Now's the time to do that.
Mm-hmm. Going back to we were talking about earlier about fears and obstacles, and taking a roots trip is a large step. It's financially, also logistically. So for those who might be thinking, well, it is, regardless of the COVID situation, it's just, it's a very big step. There are also steps in between to get to know the place better. So for instance, we have a team of 10 people on the ground in China who do just that, visiting villages and taking not just their smartphone, but we can also do 360 camera footage, work with drones, and basically give you a village visit experience that is virtual. And especially in these COVID times, but also if you might have other fears and obstacles, that is also something to consider. So we do that for quite a lot of customers where we go to the village, we document like visually everything that there is, but also we then open the webcam and do a call like we're doing now basically, and walk and talk people through their ancestral village while people themselves might be in San Francisco, Sydney or Lima or wherever. So there are other ways to still connect, or at least start connecting with your ancestral village. And we're currently actually partnering with institutions like NARA, the archives in the US, and several libraries and Family Search, the Mormon organization, to get more data to our database so that we can actually connect all the different source materials that have historical data about the Chinese diaspora. So whether it's an immigration record, a case file, or a cemetery record, our goal is really to link up all those records and to then link it to the pre-migration Chinese side of the family history, so in the form of a zupu or a zupu. So there are enough other things to undertake before COVID ends and actual route trips are feasible again.
Yeah, and one of the great things that you can do with the My China Roots database is that with the family tree book database that we have, if you have the name of your ancestor in Chinese characters, either your grandparent or great-grandparent, you can actually take that name in Chinese characters, put it into a search bar, and if any of the family tree books in the My China Roots database have that name in there, it'll find it for you. So it's like a really great way that if you might have some information about your family, and if we have a book here that might be for, the Li clan or the Eng clan or whatever it might be, you could potentially find your ancestor in this book and be able to get a whole history of your clan just by, finding a book in our database and finding your ancestor potentially within its pages.
root strips are so intensely personal that it is different for every single one that goes on the root strip. So if anybody in the group has an experience, I'd really be curious and fun to hear from others.
Yes, feel free to stay on and share. We'll be hanging out for a few more minutes. But otherwise, thank you everyone for coming. Thank you, Huihan. Thank you, Jeremy.
Bye. Thanks, everyone. Yeah,
Thanks everyone for coming.